Today, I spawned 100 of each crate and scientists in Rust to see what kind of loot you can expect. Last time I did this video was over half a year ago, but since then, a lot of new items were introduced to the game. So, let's begin this video with a primitive crate. Here's loot from 100 primitive crates. Some of you pointed out that I should recycle everything I get, so here's loot after recycling. And now, a basic jungle crate. With the addition of a new biome, a new crate was also introduced to the game. So here's loot from 100 basic jungle crates. And here's loot after recycling. Next up, we have a small food crate. Here's loot from 100 small food crates. I didn't recycle the food crate loot because the only recyclable here is the water jug. And now, food crate. Here's loot from 100 food crates. Next up, medical crate. Here's loot from 100 medical crates. And here's loot after recycling. And now, mine crates, usually found at the entrance to the cave. Here's loot from 100 mine crates. And here's loot after recycling. If you enjoyed this video so far, don't hesitate to subscribe and possibly help me reach 50,000 subscribers by the end of the summer. Next up, yellow barrels. Here's loot from 100 yellow barrels. And here's loot after recycling. Next, blue barrels. Here's loot from 100 blue barrels. And here's loot after recycling. Next on the list, ammo crate. Here's loot from 100 ammo crates. And here's loot after recycling. And now, small sunken crate. Here's loot from 100 small sunken crates. And here's loot after recycling. Next up, big sunken crate. Here's loot from 100 big Sunken crates. And here's loot after recycling. Next on the list, normal crates. Here's loot from 100 normal crates. And here's loot after recycling. Next, toolbox. Here's loot from 100 toolboxes. And here's loot after recycling. And now to the big crates. Military crate. Here's loot from 100 military crates. And here's loot after recycling. Next, elite crates. Here's loot from 100 elite crates. And here's loot after recycling. And now, locked crate. Here's loot from 100 locked crates. And here's loot after recycling. Apparently, an oil rig locked crate is a bit different from a land locked crate, so here's loot from 100 oil rig locked crates. And here's loot after recycling. Next up, Bradley Crate. Here's loot from 100 Bradley crates. And here's loot after recycling. And now, Heli Crate. Here's loot from 100 Heli Crates. And here's loot after recycling. And now, supply drop. Recently, supply drop table had a buff, so here's loot from 100 supply drops. And here's loot after recycling. I decided to also include the seasonal packs. Here's loot from 100 of each Christmas present. And here's loot after recycling. Next, Easter eggs. Here's loot from 100 of each Easter egg. And here's loot after recycling. Lastly, Halloween bags. Here's loot from 100 of each Halloween bag. And here's loot after recycling. Last but not least, yellow and blue crates. Unfortunately, there's no way to spawn these crates, so I had to pick them up manually. I did it in the Arctic base. Anyway, here's loot from 100 blue crates. And here's loot after recycling. Lastly, yellow crate. Here's loot from 100 yellow crates. And here's loot after recycling. And now, let's move on to the scientists. Starting with the Roaming Scientist. Here's loot from 100 Roaming Scientists. And here's loot after recycling. Next up, Patrol Scientist. Here's loot from 100 Patrol Scientists. And here's loot after recycling. Next, we have the Excavator Scientist. Here's loot from 100 Excavator Scientists. And here's loot after recycling. And now, NVG Scientists, found inside a missile silo. Here's loot from 100 NVG Scientists. And here's loot after recycling. Next up, Oil Rig Scientists. Here's loot from 100 Oil Rig Scientists. And here's loot after recycling. And now, Cargo Ship Scientists. Here's loot from 100 Cargo Ship Scientists. And here's loot after recycling. Next on the list, Military Tunnel Scientist. Here's loot from 100 Military Tunnel Scientists. And here's loot after recycling. Now, Military Base Scientists. Here's loot from 100 Military Base Scientists. And here's loot after recycling. Next, Heavy Scientists. Here's loot from 100 Heavy Scientists. And here's loot after recycling. Next on the list, Flamethrower Scientist. Here's loot from 100 Flamethrower Scientists. And here's loot after recycling. Next up, Minigun Scientist. Here's loot from 100 Minigun Scientists. And here's loot after recycling. And now, the brand new Outbreak Scientists. The problem is that the loot I received didn't match the loot in the Rust wiki. I haven't had time to explore the jungle yet, so let me know which one is accurate. Anyway, here's loot from 100 Outbreak Scientists. And here's loot after recycling. Next, underwater dwellers. Here's loot from 100 underwater dwellers. And here's loot after recycling. Next up, tunnel dwellers. Here's loot from 100 tunnel dwellers. And here's loot after recycling. Last but not least, Arctic-based scientists. Unfortunately, there's no way to spawn them, so I also had to manually loot them in the Arctic base. So, here's loot from 100 Arctic-based scientists. And here's loot after recycling. So, that's pretty much it with the video. If you enjoyed it, leave a like and a sub. It really helps me out a lot. And until the next time, stay cool, survivors.